So until now, we have been hard coding our data in terms of which donut cards we want to now render. And I hope in the background of your mind, you've been thinking, maybe there's a better way that's coming. That is exactly true. We are now going to look at the ng4 directive. So much the same of this ngIf, ng4 is a similar directive in the fact that it's a behavioral directive. It's also a template directive. So naturally, it's going to begin with this asterisk. That means that it's going to do something with our element or a component, which also means that we can provide this other syntax of ngTemplate. Now, we don't need two versions of the same code. So what I'm going to do is stick with my personal choice, and that's using this ng container above. So we're left with a piece of code that looks like so. Now, instead of having 3 donut cards, because if we then were to remove one of our data sets, we're then going to throw an error because one of these isn't going to exist. So much like in JavaScript, we just want to simply loop over each particular card and only render the ones that are given to us in the data. So if we now were to hit save, we then have our just chocolate. We could then switch over to number 1, swap out to our promo. But this doesn't really help us achieve dynamically rendering our donut cards. So what can we do? How do we essentially loop over our data set and print out a card in the same way that we would with JavaScript? Now, in recent years, JavaScript has introduced the for of loop, and Angular implements something very similar. So what we can turn to is the ng4 directive. Now, what I'm going to do is bump these onto their own lines, and we're then going to add, in the same way that we've added ngIf, we're going to add ng4 equals. So this is our opportunity to now say let donut of donuts. And in recent years, JavaScript has introduced the for of loop. And this is basically giving us the same syntax of an iterable. Our donuts is an iterable collection. And as we progress through your Angular learning journey, we're also going to be dealing with things such as observables. But we don't need to worry about this too much just yet. We can just use a plain data set. So now that we have this let donut, we want to now pass in each single item. We can then hit save, and you can now see that we have our items which have been printed out. We can check that this is working in terms of our ng4, because underneath we have these ngreflect ng4 of. So under the hood, Angular is actually using a for of directive, and by specifying this asterisk in ng4, we're saying this is the template that I want to repeat for every item. So we could use this on an element, or we could use this on a component as we are doing. So this is a really nice practice because if you can see, we're not really using much HTML. We have our container div, and then we have our ng container, which simply then toggles either the donut cards, or it toggles our template that simply displays that nothing is there. So all we are doing in this smart component is taking our data, which later will be fetched via a GET request to our backend, and then we're just delegating the data down to another component. So in this component, we are abiding by the rules of one-way data flow and this smart container and dumb component approach. We're using the Angular directives to simply instruct Angular on what to render and why, and then we're just looping over each particular element. Now, as we progress through the course, we're then going to be able to click on these, change the URL via the Angular router, make some updates to the particular item, save things, delete things, update them, and then we'll come back to this and see those new changes reflected, as well as the data in our database. So let's leave things there. What I want to do is talk about performance in the next lesson, where we're going to talk about identities and this idea of object references. Don't worry too much, I'm going to explain it fully. So let's jump into the next lesson, and we're going to add something called a track by, which is then going to manage our collections and make sure that we are re-rendering and rendering them in the most efficient way that we can. For now though, we've learned how to implement a JavaScript style for of loop by using the ng4, which is a dedicated directive for simply repeating an element based on the data that we give it. We now have a pretty powerful UI in terms of the data that's being displayed or perhaps not displayed, and the items which are then repeated, And all we've done is add two directives and pass it some data. So I think by getting to this point, you can start to see the power that Angular is giving us in the way that we can declaratively generate UI and manage things like the updates of when data is and isn't available.